All right, hello again, everyone. This is Hannah DeWitt, your instructor, back again with another pre-recorded lecture. This time we're going over Chapter 18, the Traditional Arts of Asia. And as always, this is based off of Prevo's art forms and also taking inspiration from my cohort, Erica Lewis. And I actually am going to be using quite a few slides from Erica Lewis right at the beginning and then a bunch more at the end. So I'll let you know when those are coming up, but I just liked the way that, I liked the contemporary examples that they had, and then I also like this sort of introduction because I feel like the book just gets straight into like different forms of architecture and doesn't really introduce you to what we're talking about. So these first 3 slides are by Erica Lewis, but let's just talk a bit about Asia and, what is it? I'm kidding. But the art and history throughout the ages of Asia started in the Paleolithic times, just like everyone else. Started with hunter-gatherer societies, then moved towards agricultural villages, and then finally we got to Bronze Age kingdoms. Also, India is central geographically and culturally with its influence as it radiates outward. Ideas were not borrowed in full from India, but instead they merged and adapted as they traveled outward from India. So we're going to start with India. Here are artifacts from the ancient city of Harappa, which show some themes found in later Indian art as well. The sculptures had a sensual naturalism with realistic human figure, not idealized like in the West. So on the right here, you can see this is a very realistic, attainable body shape. It's not the perfection like the Greeks would want us to believe. Now let's talk about the Vedic period. In the Vedic period, people believed that the universe evolved in cycles of creation and destruction, including being reincarnated after death. And there was belief in one supreme form of wisdom, not like specifically a god, but a great wisdom, a great spirit of sorts. Also, the culture was defined by a series of Hindu hymns called Vedas, and that's the reason why it's called the Vedic period. Now, getting into Buddhist art, which originated in India. Achieving enlightenment, so this is just kind of to explain a little bit about what Buddhism is in case you don't know. Achieving enlightenment ends the cycle of reincarnation and brings nirvana, the final cycle of death and rebirth, no sense of self, pain, or desire. This is actually, I don't want to say it's funny to me, but I find it kind of relatable that the reward at the end of finally being reincarnated so many times, and each time you learned a valuable lesson, and your next reincarnation was to teach you a lesson that you needed based on the last one, and then when you finally get it right, and you finally reach enlightenment, the reward is just to not have to exist anymore. I don't know why, but I find that, a little bit comically relatable, but anyway. Also, in terms of art, Buddhist art initially did not allow icons, but they were later welcomed for contemplation aids. Also, the Buddhist belief system is based on 4 noble truths, and these are the 4 noble truths. The first is that existence is suffering. The second is that the cause of suffering is desire. The third is to eliminate suffering, one must eliminate desire. And the fourth is to eliminate desire, one must follow the moral code of the Eightfold Path, which regulates how you're supposed to speak, think, and act. So each one kind of builds off of the last, but altogether that is the belief system of Buddhism. So now let's get into some Buddhist art. Still talking about India, obviously. And like I said, they used icons to support contemplation, and not at first, but then after a while, they started using them all the time. So it became a big thing. And also, artistic and architectural styles were influenced by regional cultures. So different places had things look different. So let's talk about some architectural styles that are regional to India. First, we have the stupa, which is a sort of dome-like structure evolved from earlier burial mounds. And it has 4 gates, like 4 openings to it, that are each aimed in the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And also, devotees would walk around its ritual path. So it had a sort of meditative path for you to walk in a form of ritual. And that is the stupa. Now, let's talk a bit about the Great Stupa, because there's one specific stupa called the Great Stupa, which is like the most important stupa in India, I'm supposing. I mean, not trying to like talk down about the other stupas, but this one is like the most famous one. So it was actually built over a period of about 200 years. And the gateways include layers of sculpture in relief. So here I've got an image that's like a detail just showing these relief sculptures on the gates. And these sculptures tell the story of Buddha's life, but they don't depict him directly. So we're still kind of in that early period of not wanting to have imagery of the Buddha, so having creative solutions to get the story across without directly producing his image. And then later on, they started being more okay with directly producing images of the Buddha. So let's talk a bit about the evolution of Buddhist architecture. We've got 4 examples here, and they all kind of like, each one builds off the last, just like the 4 Noble Truths. So Buddhist pagodas merged with Indian stupas and the Chinese watchtowers, and all of this together results in this stepped tower that was adopted and changed by the Japanese. So this is like, they're all related, and the combination of them all kind of created this final form that you see, the Japanese pagoda. So that's sort of like how things radiated from India to China, then to Japan, and was elaborated on a little bit more each time. Now, moving on from architecture, let's talk about just art itself, sculpture, painting, things like that. Here we're looking at sculpture. This is from Gandhara, which is now Afghanistan/Pakistan. And this distinctive style was gained after Alexander the Great's conquest of the area, and it sort of merged the styles from both Eastern and Western cultures. This particular statue is a statue of a bodhisattva. So to explain what a bodhisattva is, the Buddha is a bodhisattva, but supposedly he's not the only one. It's like a category of person. It is a person who has reached enlightenment, but instead of like crossing over and having their enlightenment, they choose to stay on the mortal plane in order to help others achieve enlightenment. So they put off their reward out of selflessness and stay in the realm of pain and suffering in order to help others find their way and find their path. And so the Buddha is supposedly a bodhisattva, but there are others as well. And this is a sculpture of a bodhisattva. Now, the sculptor here shows knowledge of both Roman and Greek traditions, but is also meshing it with Indian styles and, the more Eastern style of sculpting as well. And also, this bodhisattva is depicted with rich garments and jewels, which is more so to honor the bodhisattva for their selflessness, not as much trying to say that they had that in their life, because part of the Eightfold Path is not having lots of overwhelming amounts of wealth and vanity. So it's an interesting addition that all of these rich garments and jewels are on the bodhisattva here. Now let's talk a bit about the Gutpa dynasty. which was from about the year 320 to the year 540. And it was noted for developments in politics, law, math, and the arts. And here we're looking at a sculpture from the Gupta dynasty. This was a carved stone standing Buddha. And it has a very simplified mass of the figure. You see it's not like the arms and the shoulders, I feel like, are a good example, especially. It's not all broken up into different muscles. It's just kind of like one long tube of an arm with a bit of a crook at the elbow. Also, this sculpture shows the Buddha wearing a conventional monk garment. He has long earlobes to refer to the fact that he once had his earlobes stretched when he was a prince as a child. And his top knot, or the bun on the top of his head, symbolizes his enlightenment. Now let's get into some painting. So this is a beautiful Bodhisattva by Padmapani. And this shows both fine linear definition and elegance, but also very full, rounded shapes. And this style spread with Buddhism to China and Southeast Asia, once again starting from India. Now, still in India, but switching to a different religion or spiritual pathway, let's talk about Hindu art. So the principal gods of Hindu are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And Hindu temples all have two parts. There is a porch for the purification of the worshipper, and then there is a place on the inside called the Garbha Griha. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing anything in this episode, by the way. But the Garbha Griha is the sacred womb chamber where an image of the god is kept. And in this specific example, this is the Kandarya Mahadeva temple. And in this, you can tell where the Garbha Griha is because it's marked by the tallest tower there. So that kind of like sort of to the left one, that is where the Garbha Griha is. Now, this is also on the same temple that we were just looking at. This is just a detail. This is the Kandarya Mahadeva temple as well. But something that is very prominent in Hindu art is erotica. And I mean, I think we've all heard of the Kama Sutra. There's a lot of erotic art, and it is a part of art history, and it is important to learn about, even if it's like a little bit like awkward for you. It's still an important part of the history. So in the Hindu belief, these erotic scenes symbolize divine love in the human form. Like the incarnate of love is physically having sex in this belief system. And it's sort of like an allegory of the ultimate spiritual unity is allowing your body to unify with another's. And in this example, we can see a sort of natural beauty and fullness of the human figure. The figures aren't overly idealized. They're not unachievable body types. And that is another thing to note. So this is maybe an awkward slide, but it's a very important part of the culture. Now let's talk about Shiva. Here's Shiva as the Lord of the Dance. He is very playful in this one. Shiva encompasses creation, preservation, dissolution, and recreation. And these roles are shown in sculptures that are rich in iconography. So there's a lot of symbolism in these sculptures. For example, this one, Shiva as the Lord of the Dance, he's performing within the orb of the sun. Also, that little like baby that he's stepping on he's not like evil and stepping on a baby. That's actually the monster of ignorance, and he is trampling the monster of ignorance. Also, all around the circle, which represents the sun, there's also the purifying fire of destruction and creation. And in the Hindu belief system, every time you pass away and reincarnate before your next life, you have like a sort of fire baptism in which your old life is like literally burned away from you. So this purifying fire of destruction and creation is kind of about that. And there is the implication of movement here. Clearly he's in the middle of a dance move. And these multiple arms and gestures not only are iconic of the way that a lot of like Hindu gods and goddesses and whatnot are portrayed, but also it kind of shows all of these different positions that his arms could be in over time. So it shows like more of a dance than just one pair of arms could show you of the dance, if that makes any sense. Also, his impassive, composed face indicates that there's nothing to fear. So this is Shiva, Lord of the Dance. Now, moving on from sculpture into more like painting and drawing, there were Muslim techniques used in Hindu art to render Hindu subjects. This is specifically because of the conquer by the Islamic Mughal rulers in the 16th century, and it is called the Basholi style. Now, this example is called The Approach of Krishna, and in it, there's a sort of erotic tension between Krishna and this devotee here, and this erotic desire is supposed to symbolize the spiritual longing for union with the divine, and also the very bright, vivid colors reflect the emotional state. It's quite joyful, actually. Now, let's move on from India to Southeast Asia. What we're talking about is what is now called Vietnam, but at the time it was under Chinese rule. It had the cultural influence from India, and it had not like a hybrid, but just both of both religious paths of Buddhism and Hinduism were present. And this architectural site that we're looking at is called a Borobudur, and this is an elaborate version of a stupa. It's more than 10 miles of relief sculpture along the corridors, so the amount of time it took to sculpt it was wild. And also, pilgrims, so people who come on a religious journey to visit it, would walk through it and contemplate the landscape. So it's very much meant to provide like a guided walking meditation as you explore the place. Now let's talk about Angkor Wat, which is in Cambodia. This was influenced by the Borobudur, but it's a little bit different. As you can see, it's got these multiple towers instead of one kind of large pyramid coming up to the top. It also faces due west, and Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and Hindu gods are all here, but they're appearing to be portraits of real human rulers. So even these Eastern cultures are not free from this political influence over religious imagery. Also, it was originally surrounded by a moat, but no longer is. And it has an emphasis on fertility in the sort of like meaning of what is worshipped here in this place. The ruler at the time who built the place actually thought of himself as a descendant of Vishnu. So that is part of the story of, why it was built. Now that we've kind of covered that Southeast Asia area, let's get into China. China has this rich interaction of traditions from Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, all prior to the modern period. So in terms of the art of ancient China, we have a lot of bronze objects from their Bronze Age. This specific one is a ritual vessel, and it has intricate composite animal forms on it. So the face in the center of this is called a Teyote Mask, which is a sort of composite monster with wings, claws, and horns. And the meaning of the Teyote Mask is unfortunately unknown by historians right now, but it does appear on a whole lot of different Chinese bronze vessels, such as this one. People think that it is meant to honor ancestors in some way, and that the beliefs around these sort of Teyote Mask creatures evolve later into some of the beliefs that found Confucianism. Now, more art of ancient China. One of the biggest, I guess, commissioners of art, a patron, he had a lot of art made for him, was the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. And he actually unified China before his death in 210 BCE. And he was intent upon him being guarded in his afterlife. So he actually had about 6,000 terracotta warriors made by artists to protect him in his afterlife. Now, moving a little bit forward in time, we've got the Han Dynasty. A good art example from this is the Wu family shrine, which is an elaborate relief sculpture that is supposedly full of energy. Specifically, the energy that they're talking about is the inner life force that flows through all things called qi. So, apparently this relief sculpture is meant to be full of qi. Now, still in the Han Dynasty, we start seeing the emergence of Taoism, which the main goal of Taoism is achieving harmony with the life force that animates all beings. If you've ever seen the sort of yin and yang image where it's like the combination of the good and the bad, and there's bad and the good, and there's good and the bad and all that originates from Taoism. Now, this example of a piece of Taoist art is Mirror with Zwang Moo. So Zwang Moo was a real life woman in ancient China who was considered the Queen Mother of the West, and she was someone who was considered to be in harmony of the Tao. So, you know, we think of people in Western culture that we think like Mother Teresa or something was like a great example of someone who's like in harmony with God. People thought that Zwang Moo was in perfect harmony with the Tao, and a lot of people looked up to her. So she's featured on the left here, the left of the sort of circle in the middle, and then across from her, opposite of her, sits Lord Duke of the East, who supposedly they would meet each other yearly on the 7th day of the 7th month. And the inscription on this outside of it, all of it is meant to tell the fortune of the owner, Zwang Moo. So this also is a mirror. You might not be able to see that, and that's because it's a mirror on the other side. So it's shining on the opposite side, but there's really not a point of taking a photograph of the mirror side when this is where the art is. Now let's get into the Chinese painting tradition, because there is a long tradition of painting, and all of the Chinese painting tradition really stems from the Chinese calligraphy tradition. So Chinese painting really combines calligraphy and the landscape. Painting and writing were considered very closely related, and they would use the same brushes and the same ink for both. This example by Fan Quan is Travelers Among the Mountains and Streams. Quan was regarded as the greatest landscape painter of the Song Dynasty, which was between the years 960 and 1279. And Quan made imaginative creations intended to capture the energy of nature, but were not a real place. So these were all imagined landscapes. You can see these massive cliffs in vertical composition here in the background. And then there's also very textured details from very specific brushwork techniques that were learned over a very long period of time and taught from one sort of master painter to another painter. Now, still in the Chinese painting tradition, the Song Dynasty was displaced in the year 1125, and was replaced also with a new painting style called the Southern Hangzhou. My apologies again if I mispronounce anything here. And this emphasized smaller, more intimate landscapes, such as Washing the Deer by a Pine-Shaded Stream by Ma Yan, which has meticulous brushwork in the foreground, but it fades into mist in the background. So, like I've been saying over and over again throughout this class, atmospheric perspective. And then we also have an off-balance composition here. Not everything is centered in the middle, and that adds a little bit of intrigue, a little bit of making it a bit more dynamic that way. Also, a term to know is literati painting. Literati painting is basically paintings made by amateurs that devoted their life to art and poetry, but they were not government sponsored. They didn't receive funding for their art. So because of this, they didn't have as much money, but they were able to be a lot more creative because they weren't answering to anyone as to what they had to make. So a lot of the most interesting developments in art style come from the literati paintings, or painters. Now, still talking about the Chinese painting tradition, we've got the Yuan dynasty, which comes next. And here we have Dwelling in the Fuchun Mountains by Hyung Yang. And this is actually a hand scroll. Hand scrolls were huge in Chinese painting, like in the whole tradition. It's meant to be viewed by scrolling from the right hand to the left hand, so you don't see it all at once like you're seeing here. You would see a small section at a time and then roll out the next place and roll up a little bit from behind and roll out a little more and roll up a little bit from behind. And in that way, these paintings had a sense of time to them. It was very chronological. You could tell a story from one end to the other. So these also had a lot of respect for the past in these traditions. Painters were expected to comprehend tradition before they could ever express their individuality, which I think is common in a lot of traditional art learning practices, is you have to know the rules before you can break them, but it was even more so in China. So, in terms of respect for the past, here is a comparison. The Travelers by Fan Quan that we already looked at is on the left, and then on the right we've added a new image, Fisherman's Flute, Heard Over the Lake by Qiu Ying. And there's a lot of similarities here. Both have looming massive forms offset with fine details, and both have the motif of a scholar finding refreshment in nature. So that is just kind of an example of how things repeat themselves throughout history, and specifically when you're in a tradition that is so much wanting you to have respect for the past, you're just more likely to repeat those same visual motifs. Now, let's talk a bit about the development of Chinese painting in Ming and later dynasties. So, getting closer to recent times, there was a sort of feud between academic style painting and literati style painting. And this is a literati style painting. This is Cicada on a Banana Leaf. And this had free, loose execution, but also had subtle political commentary. The cicada itself is a symbol of rebirth. And the artist, Bada Shanren, supposedly put the cicada there because of his hope for the resurrection of the Ming Dynasty, because this was soon after the Ming Dynasty came to a close. Now, we're finally moving on from the Chinese painting tradition and getting into Chinese ceramics a little bit. I only have this one example, but there's so much of this. I'm sure you've all seen blue and white pottery, and that is from the Chinese tradition of ceramics. They were all held in very high regard and were worth a lot of money in international trade. And they were all pretty much made of porcelain, which is a more delicate and more expensive form of clay. It turns white once it's fired in the kiln, And the reason that we see blue and white all the time is because initially only the blue color that they had could withstand the high temperatures of the kiln. They've developed other colors that can withstand the temperatures of the kiln since then, but at the time, blue was the only option that they had. Now, we're done with China. Let's talk a bit about Korea, and specifically Korean art, of course. So, Korea took Chinese ceramic styles and made variations on them. There was this sort of blue-green celadon glaze that has a very different look to it than the blue glaze on white porcelain. And you can see it here in this wine pitcher. Also, they would etch shapes into the outside and then fill those shapes with white or black slip before firing again. So that's how they got the white and black colors there. And in case you don't remember, slip is sort of like clay mixed with water, but like blended up until it has the consistency of pancake batter, basically. So it's like much more liquidy clay. Also, talking about Korean art, something to note is the Lotus Sutra. That's what we're looking for here, and it is an illustrated manuscript meant for Buddhist teachings, and it is actually made of very, very fine strands of silver and gold. So this is a very precious, very expensive to create work of art that illustrates Buddhist teachings to aid in spreading Buddhism. And last but not least, we're going to talk a bit about Japan, starting with their architecture, because just like how everything kind of irradiated out from India to Japan, by the time all of these styles got to Japan, there was each step of the way it had been elaborated on, so we get the most complex stuff when we get to Japan. Specifically, thinking about the Shinto religion, which is a religion of nature and ancestor worship, but also includes belief in a building or a home having a spirit of its own. So taking extra care and time in architecture makes sense when you put it in the context of Shintoism. Also in Shintoism, gods dwell in forests, fields, waterfalls, and huge stones. And this specific example is the Aiwei shrine. I'm going to be honest, I don't actually know how to pronounce that. It might be Ise or Ice. I'm not sure. But this shrine, luckily it's easy to spell. This shrine is actually torn down and rebuilt every 20 years. And it was first built in the year 685, but since then it's been rebuilt countless times. And it is a sacred site within a forest, and its design combines simplicity with subtlety. So there's not a lot of flashiness here, which makes sense considering they're just going to have to build it again in another 20 years. So the first very distinct cultural borrowing that we see in Japan came in the 7th century when the Japanese Emperor Shotoko sent emissaries to China to study the civilization. And they returned very impressed and implemented a lot of things from China in their own lifestyle, such as the emperor actually converted to Buddhism and made Chinese Buddhism be the sort of nationally recognized religion. But the Shinto gods weren't just forgotten. Instead, they became sacred beings, and that kind of made it easier for the Japanese people to assimilate into this more Chinese culture. Also, this same emperor implemented Chinese script, so the way that they write letters or words, started using that, and also started implementing Confucian teachings into the Japanese culture as well. So this is a lot of Chinese culture very suddenly being put into Japanese culture. Now, a good example of something built during this time is the temple complex of Horyuji, which is a Buddhist monastery Also, there is a sort of hall inside of it called the kondo, which is a golden hall where Buddha statues are kept. And also, it is built with an elaborate bracketing system, so there's actually no nails or screws or anything like that holding this together. It's just a very elaborate series of pegs that fit into holes that are cut to be exactly the perfect size so that they fit together, which is a lot harder to do, but it's quite impressive. Another less flashy example of Japanese architecture, kind of coming a little bit after this time, is, well, actually, like 10 centuries after this time, so a little more than a little bit. But this is the Katsura Detached Palace, which has a blend of human-made and natural elements. It has sliding screens, which ended up becoming very popular in Japan, and allowed indoor-outdoor flow. And there was no real grand entrance here. It was really down to earth. This was actually a tea house, which was constructed of common natural materials. And it embodies the attitude of simplicity, of naturalness, and mostly of humility. So this is a lot less flashy and a lot more down to earth as an example of some architecture here. Now, moving on from architecture to just like regular sculpture, painting, and prints, we have the Kamakura period. This period happened around the year 1200, and it was known for its vigorous realism. And a great example of this is this wood portrait statue of Mukachu. The creator of this, Unkai, was considered to be one of the greatest sculptors in Japan, especially at the time. And it depicts a legendary Buddhist priest. And as you can see, the facial expression is very vivid. There's a lot of detail in the sort of wrinkles of the face. And also there's a very delicate hand gesture. It's kind of cut off. You can't see it all in this image, but you can tell that he is like touching the thing in his hands very lightly. It's just a very masterfully done sculpture with a lot of realism. Moving more towards paintings, still in the Kamakura period though, hand scrolls were suited for long narratives. So we've still got this idea of the hand scroll, but with a bit of a Japanese twist. The subjects were depicted with more vividness, more kind of illustrativeness. Like you'll notice that they're a little bit more cartoony. Here is an example. This is the illustrated legends of the Kitano Shrine, and it narrates the early history of an important Shinto site. And this specific moment that it's narrating is when a thunder god wreaked havoc on a courtly gathering. The scroll reflects the strong role that nature plays in Shinto beliefs, and other parts of it include other depictions of floods, storms, and other natural phenomena. Now, looking more towards something a bit more chill, we've got Zen Buddhism, which really came to light in Japan. And this is the idea of enlightenment through meditation. This is a work that is actually by a Buddhist priest who also made art. This is by Shou. And this Buddhist priest incorporated art making into, his practice, and simplified this like explosive sort of very painterly splashes of ink called haboku. And this is specifically called Haboku Splashed Ink Landscape. It was inspired by the Southern Songmasters, and it has the mere suggestions of lines and forms, but no real detail of anything. So it's very airy and light and fluid and dynamic in that way. Now, more examples of painting in Japan. We start seeing a lot of folding screens. And this is specifically because they were functional in homes to serve as a sort of partition between spaces, to provide a little bit of privacy, or just to divide a space and make it feel like two separate rooms in a way. This example is Waves at Matsushima. And this is 6 different screens that can form compositions together, but also if you look at them separately, they hold their own compositionally. And they feature a lot of abstracted shapes and spatial ambiguity. I mean, looking at it as a whole, you can see that it's kind of like a landscape of these like poking out mountains with trees over water. But everything is so abstracted that it's not really grounded in reality. And it also has an emphasis on repeated patterns, specifically looking at the patterns in the waves of the ocean. Now, moving on more to prints. There was a very popular style of woodcut printing. I mean, when we talked about printmaking, I made it very clear that woodcuts were all the rage in Japan. This specific style of woodcut printing is called ukiyo-e, and it literally means pictures of the floating world. And so these normally were scenes of daily life, like landscapes, entertainers, and actors. They were things that were not like mystical or spiritual, but things that you would actually encounter in your day-to-day world. This example by Kitagawa Utamaro is called Reflected Beauty, and it turns an ordinary subject into a memorable image. This is not a famous person or a spiritual leader. This is just an average woman. And it uses very flat shapes with a lack of shading, which is very iconic to the Japanese printmaking and woodcutting style. And also, you start to see a very cropped composition here. There's more happening outside of where the image ends, but it's cropped to just show the most interesting part. Now, let's talk a bit about how all of this came to Europe, because actually, Europeans went crazy over the Japanese style of printmaking. There was this whole movement called Japanism where, like, it kind of was what led into Impressionism, and we'll talk about that more when we get to, like, the closer, like, modern arts and stuff. But Europeans went crazy over this stuff. And this was because it was initially brought to Europe during Commodore Perry's 1854 mission, which actually caused turbulence amongst aristocracy at the time. But the emperor was restored in 1868. Despite that, it began a period of cultural importation from the West. So a lot of Western cultures started buying up all of the art that they could from the East because they were fascinated by it, and it was unlike any of the art that they were seeing from their own place. This example is the Battle of Sano Shrine, and it depicts the turning point in a conflict. It's an actual battle that happened, and it has very unprecedented journalistic accuracy for the time and the place. So it was literally documented by an artist who witnessed the battle themselves, and they made art of what they saw. And in this way, they were able to almost use it like a form of journalism. And then last, before we get into contemporary examples, I just wanted to feature the artist Yoshitoshi, who really started with violence and then moved towards folklore in what they became famous for. They were well known for their violent prints, like the one that we just saw, but they eventually took up more gentle folkloric subjects. For example, here we see the enlightenment of Jigoku Deu. This character is a sex worker, like an escort, but she actually achieved enlightenment after an encounter with a Buddhist monk. And this is a relatively simple composition, but it's very skillful printmaking when you think of all of the different colors and values that went into it, knowing that they all had to be carved out of different pieces of wood. Now with that, let's get into some contemporary examples. Now, I'm not super familiar with a lot of contemporary examples other than like Aiwei and a few others, but my cohort Erica Lewis had so many wonderful contemporary examples of Asian artists and artworks. So I just snagged literally all of the examples they had. So all of the rest of the slides were made by Erica Lewis. Thank you so much, Erica. I'm putting a link in the description so you can, if you want, go watch their video in which they probably explain all of this a lot better than me. But I just want to give credit where credit's due. All of the rest of these examples came from Erica Lewis. So let's look at some contemporary Asian artists. First, we've got Shilpa Gupta, who is an Indian sculptor and installation artist who works with text and sound and examines cultural identity as it relates to personal perception. Next, we've got Yoshitomo Nara, and this is a Japanese multimedia artist who works with printmaking, sculpture, painting, ceramics, and installation. And actually, this is a relatively famous artist. I've seen their work around, and it's very charming. The subjects are usually very cute yet sinister children and animals. Like, they have this very cutesy enlarged head and large eyes, but there's something about their facial expressions that just makes them look evil. Moving on to an artist that is from China, but actually is now local to Louisville and is one of my cohorts, and also teaches undergrads here because she's also working on her MFA just like Erica and I are. This is Zen Chen. Zen Chen is a Chinese glass, ceramic, and installation artist, and she focuses a lot on environmental concerns, often including found objects such as plastic bags in her work. So you can actually see her work here in Louisville. She's not far from you at all. She goes to the same school as you. Next, we have Aiwei. I've already talked about him a bit before, and one of the earlier videos, I think I showed you his example of all of the backpacks that he put of all of those dead children. Well, he does a ton of stuff. He's a Chinese multimedia sculpture, photo, and public installation artist, and a human rights activist. And he responds to political, cultural, and social issues, and actually has gotten in so much trouble. Like, he's gotten beaten up and like banned from China and stuff for all of the political and social issues that he brings to light in ways that people just don't want that information for everyone to see. They want it to be silenced, and they don't like the fact that he's making this work, and it just takes a lot of bravery, and his work is very impressive. So definitely Google Aiwei if you get a chance. You will not be disappointed. Next, we've got Dinh Q Le. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that as well. But this is a Vietnamese-American photographer and video and installation artist who looks a lot at Vietnamese culture and history. So you can see here all of these photos and scraps of paper are all like delicately woven together to create these giant like square cube shapes. But yeah, that is Dinh Q Le. Next, we've got Sashim George Sebastian, who is an Indian cut paper and installation artist who uses the very delicate medium of cutting paper itself and uses paper with geometry, engineering, and architecture to create some very interesting installations here. And on the right here, you can see there's also a utilization of light and shadow. Another contemporary artist, we've got Reena Kalet. This is an Indian sculptor and installation artist who uses and alters found objects, like arranging rubber stamps of names. So that is what you see on the left. And then here we've got like a sort of ironing board situation, but very creative, interesting artist here. And then here we have Leroy New. This one is very exciting and colorful and just a bit of eye candy, to be honest. Leroy New is a Filipino sculptor and installation artist and uses recycled plastic items to create these amazingly colorful, otherworldly spaces. Next, still colorful, but a bit more subdued, a bit more natural, we've got Hyung Yang. Apologies again if I mispronounced that. This is a South Korean installation artist and sculptor who investigates displacement and uses found objects and sensory elements like scent and sound to create a really full experience with the art, not just visually. Next, we've got another Chinese artist that is now local to Louisville and is one of my cohorts and goes to your school basically, but is like in the graduate program, not in the undergraduate program. This is Jinan Wang, and she's great. She's so great. Her stuff is so impressive. She is a Chinese oil painter who works with photorealism and symbolism, and she deals with her identity as a female immigrant in America through her works. Next, we have Gao Chiang, and this is a Chinese artist who uses gunpowder and other explosives to create performances, sculptures, and drawings. So if you ever want to see something quite amazing, you can look him up on YouTube. He literally will paint and draw with gunpowder on a very, very large canvas, and then light it on fire and it explodes, and all of the marks from the explosion are what's left behind to create the artwork. Next, we've got Tomoko Nagao. This is a Japanese multimedia artist, digital painting, installation, and street art, who works a lot with pop art, with these bright colors and bold outlines, and also appropriated imagery from popular culture and art history. So here we've got, on the left, this is the Birth of Venus reimagined in a more modern Japanese sense. And then on the right, we've got The Great Wave by Hokusai, but with all of this pop culture of fast food and ramen and McDonald's and Hello Kitty. And just very much thinking about consumerism and the visual elements of consumerism that we're all constantly surrounded by, and how these have taken over our visual culture. Next, we have yet another amazing Chinese artist who is now local to Louisville and is also in the MFA program. I sound like a broken record, I'm sure, but this is Jing Yang. Jing Shou is also amazing. She paints on silk, and it looks so cool. Like, it looks so good. You should look at her work. You should look at all of these people's work. But Jing Yang is a Chinese painter and drawer who conceptually deals with human connections and relationships. She has a sort of series where she starts painting a stranger, and then by the end of the painting, they're clearly no longer strangers. She also uses traditional Chinese media, like ink on silk, for her contemporary styles and concepts. So that's an interesting sort of combination of the old and the new there. And then last but not least, we've got one of my personal favorites, Takashimurakami, who is a Japanese painter, sculptor, digital artist, and animator, who also works with pop art, but in a slightly different style, with bright colors, bold outlines, and the cartoon style super flat theory in the 1990s, which blends art and commerce. Not high art like the West, but still working a lot with these ideas of commercialism. And this artist has collaborated with Louis Vuitton, Crocs, Kanye West, Pharrell Williams, I don't know why I couldn't say Pharrell Williams, Supreme, and more. So this is clearly a very successful, influential artist doing all of these collaborations with these very famous people and brands. And that is all of the contemporary artists. Thank you again so much, Erica Lewis, for compiling these contemporary artists for us. I really think the book just leaves us with only ancient works in this section and doesn't really talk about what Asian artists are doing now. And I really appreciate that someone put together all of these examples, so thank you. So that is all for today. I'll see you guys in class, and have a good one.